What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 13 Final Look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 13, let's take a look at the quarterback position. One of my favorite quarterbacks this week is Kirk Cousins from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins has averaged 19.4 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 30, 27, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's going to be about 4% owned, projected at 19.1 fantasy points here in Week 13. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Minnesota Vikings favored by 10. So you got a fantastic matchup, a high-scoring game, and Kirk Cousins gets Adam Thielen back this week. He's been fantastic over the past few weeks. Got an excellent matchup here this week. So I like Kirk Cousins here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Another quarterback I like is Philip Rivers from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Houston Texans, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Philip Rivers has averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season, but he scored 19, 22, and 19 fantasy points in the past 3 weeks, so he's been on fire. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 17.5 fantasy points here in Week 13, and he's $5,900 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, and they have the Colts favored by 3.5. So great matchup here, high scoring game, close competitive game. So I like Philip Rivers here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, now these next couple of quarterbacks both had awful weeks last week, which is pulling their ownership down, their salary's low, and they've got pretty good matchups. So I like Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the New York Jets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Derek Carr has averaged 17.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.7 rush attempts per game. Now, he only scored 5 fantasy points last week. He was a huge letdown, so he's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 18.9 fantasy points here in Week 13, and he's $5,800 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Raiders favored by 8.5. So fantastic matchup. This is a bounce back game, so I like Derek Carr here versus the New York Jets. Now, if you're not feeling Derek Carr, take a look at Jared Goff from the LA Rams playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Jared Goff has averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.2 rush attempts per game. He only scored 6 fantasy points last week, but he put up 28 fantasy points the week before that. So he's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 18.3 fantasy points here in Week 13, and he's $5,800 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. So both Derek Carr and Jared Goff are the same price on both sites, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 2.5. So he's got a decent matchup. This is a bounce back game. He's got great wide receivers. He's capable of putting up big fantasy numbers. So I like Jared Goff here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I think the ownership on this guy is just way too low. I know his salary has been priced up, but he's been fantastic since coming back from injury, and now he's got a great matchup. So I like Nick Chubb from the Cleveland Browns playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Nick Chubb has averaged 19 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 16.4 rush attempts per game and 1 pass target per game. He got 19, 20, and 19 rush attempts in the last 3 games, so if you're concerned about that timeshare between Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, throw that concern out the window because he's getting plenty of volume and he's only going to be about 1% owned, projected at 15.4 fantasy points here in week 13. He's 7,700 DraftKings salary and 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 53 points scored in this game, and they have the Browns trailing by 5.5. So you got a fantastic matchup, a high-scoring game. Now the concern here is that the Browns are going to fall behind. They're going to have to abandon the run, and Nick Chubb doesn't get many pass attempts. That's Kareem Hunt's role, so he could be game scripted out of this one. But at only 1% ownership, I know you've got to pay up for Nick Chubb, but if he scores a couple of touchdowns here, you're going to jump ahead of the rest of the field. He's getting a ton of volume. Great matchup here, high-scoring game. So I like Nick Chubb here versus the Tennessee Titans. Okay, now Josh Jacobs has been ruled out, so I like Devontae Booker from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the New York Jets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Devontae Booker is going to be the starting running back here in week 13. He's going to be about 29% owned, projected at 13 fantasy points here in week 13. He's only 5,500 DraftKings salary and 500 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the Raiders favored by 8.5. So you got a good matchup and a running game script. So I like Devontae Booker here versus the New York Jets. And another low salary running back that I like here is David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery has averaged 14 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.2 rush attempts per game and 4.7 pass targets per game. He scored 28 fantasy points off of 11 rush attempts and 6 pass targets last game. His ownership is way up there. He's going to be about 29% owned, projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in week 13. He's 5,500 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Bears favored by 3. So you got a fantastic matchup, a close, competitive game. So I like David Montgomery here versus the Detroit Lions.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. And I just want to note that Kareem Hunt, he's only $5,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So if you don't want to pay up for Nick Chubb and you're concerned about the Cleveland Browns falling behind in this game, Kareem Hunt, he's averaging 14.3 rush attempts per game and 2.9 pass targets per game. So he would be the back that would benefit in a game that the Cleveland Browns fall behind. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here in week 13. He's $5,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So this is a great matchup for both of these running backs. I wouldn't play them both in the same lineup, but one of these guys is going to have a monster game, and you're getting a huge discount on Kareem Hunt. So I like Kareem Hunt here versus the Tennessee Titans. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I like Robert Woods from the LA Rams playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Robert Woods has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.9 pass targets per game and almost 2 rush attempts per game. He got 12 and 15 pass targets in the last 2 games and 1 and 2 rush attempts. So he's getting a ton of volume. He scored 16 and 34 fantasy points in those games. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 16.2 fantasy points here in week 13. And he's only $5,900 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 2.5. Decent matchup here. I just love the volume that Robert Woods is getting, and I love that he's getting a couple of rush attempts, adding some fantasy value to your wide receiver. So I like Robert Woods here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Another wide receiver I like is Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. But Brandon Cooks has averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.1 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 28% owned, projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in week 13. He's $5,600 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Houston Texans trailing by 3.5. So you got a passing game script, but the reason that the ownership is so high on Brandon Cooks is because Will Fuller is going to be out for the rest of the season. So Brandon Cooks could get more pass targets. He's going to be the number 1 wide receiver. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the Indianapolis Colts. And another wide receiver I like is DJ Chark from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Chark has averaged 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 12.1 fantasy points here in week 13. He's $5,400 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game. They have the Jacksonville Jaguars trailing by 10. So you got a fantastic matchup, a high-scoring game, and a passing game script. And DJ Chark has one of the best cornerback wide receiver matchups on the slate. So I like DJ Chark here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. My favorite tight end this week, even though he let everyone down last week, is Darren Waller from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the New York Jets, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Darren Waller has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 15.4 fantasy points here in week 13. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary and 900 more on FanDuel. So with Josh Jacobs out, they could lean on Darren Waller and give him more volume, more pass targets. He could be the focal point of this offense. Could be a nice stack with Derek Carr and Darren Waller. And you could even throw Devontae Booker in that stack. So I like Darren Waller here versus the New York Jets. Another tight end that I like is TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the Chicago Bears, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 11.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.2 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 11.3 fantasy points here in week 13. He's 5,000 DraftKings salary and 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 3. So even though they've got a tough defensive matchup versus the Chicago Bears, he's got a great positional matchup at the tight end position. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Chicago Bears. The other tight end that I like is Evan Ingram from the New York Giants playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they've been middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 9.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. He scored 21 fantasy points last week off of 9 pass targets, and he's only going to be about 1% owned, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here in week 13. He's 4,900 DraftKings salary and 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Giants trailing by 11. So you got a good matchup and a passing game script. So I like Evan Ingram at this super low ownership here versus the Seattle Seahawks. And before I forget, I also like Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points versus opposing tight ends. Mike Gesicki has averaged 8.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 9.1 fantasy points here in week 13. He's only 4,200 DraftKings salary and 1,500 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 10.5. But you got a great matchup and a guy that's getting 5 pass targets a game for the last 3 games, and he's increased his fantasy point production in each of those games, scoring 6, then 8, and then 12 fantasy points last week. So I think he's going to be involved in this game plan. He's got a great matchup. So I like Mike Gesicki here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups
using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.